a bit more this way, so
You
that
just
I
go
have
when you
more
want.
space at one side. I'll just stay in this general area.
Yeah, you can close that text, that blue thing that says the story. Oh, this way. How's your French, by the way?
I can read written French with like 98% fluency. I will panic about 2 words into a spoken sentence, though. So completely depends on the modality.
Okay, so if you're there and you're talking, you have to.
So a bit too much
So
of an
what
angle.
we'll do, you know what you do? We'll just say here something, because just say questions should be asked here and will be answered in the end of the talk. And then if somebody joins us, we'll see. So if you see somebody asking a question, you want to take it or now, as I said, we're not going to be very numerous.
How many roughly?
We'll probably have people. And others can come, but they don't usually.
Okay.
But we're good people.
The important people are here.
Mhm. So are there like any openings for later? Like for next year that you are
Not that I'm specifically aware of at the moment, no. But just have to wait and see and hope that something.
Right. So your fiance is like she can't move.
No, she's all her work is in and around Liverpool. She's a barrister, so she's the primary wage earner. So basically,
barrister is a sort of a lawyer.
Yeah, not a barista.
Not a barista. Yeah, I thought about that, but then I said no, barista. So actually, in a non-rhotic dialect, that would be just distinguished by the
Stress.
Barrister and barista.
Definitely had people get confused by that before.
Well, the thing is, in Hebrew, there's a funny thing in Hebrew that somebody invented a really stupid word for linguist. Huh? It's like some sort of a how do you call it when you put
Portmanteau?
No, when you put 2 words together and you sort of I always forget the term. I know it in Hebrew. Bonjour. Bonjour. So the word for detective is this thing, okay?
Mm-hmm.
The word for language or tongue is this, okay? The sort of profession or characteristic template is with 3 consonants and the suffix an. Okay? So the person who invented the word for linguist said, okay, I'm going to take the word for detective and the word for tongue and do 1 word in this template.
Yeah.
So it gets balshan, right? And balshan means linguist. But many people, when you tell them, I'm a Belchan, they think that you're some sort of detective.
Yeah.
And they say, oh, that's really probably very cool. And you know that they don't understand. It's not a compound. How is it called?
Portmanteau in English usually.
Portmanteau, I would use it for for something that is like one morpheme expressing two features or something.
So like, well, yeah, linguistically, yes, something like, or something like huge, where we have the class of the together and morpheme. But in sort of lay terms, portmanteau means something like Brexit, a blend of two.
It's a blend.
Blend, yeah.
That's how they call it. Blend. Yeah. It's a blend that doesn't look like a blend.
Mhm.
That's the problem.
Blends only work when it's obvious what you're blending.
And yeah, so we're waiting at least for Shiku. I think yeah, Shiku's coming. Mohammed, probably. Let me ask him. And maybe Ali. Katia, peut-être pour éviter les problèmes que vous avez eu hier ou avant-hier, c'est mieux de m'écrire avant, de dire est-ce que c'est événement, et là, moi, je me renseigne. C'est cool. Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
Thanks. How are you?
Good morning.
How are you?
Thank you.
Maybe you should sit here. So if you have questions, they will be heard.
We know a lot about Scottish Gaelic, so we won't have any questions.
Well, hopefully you will know a lot in an hour and however long.
Sorry?
Hopefully you will know a lot in an hour and however long. And won't need to ask any questions.
Are you a native speaker?
No, I'm not a native speaker. My father's a native speaker.
Yeah.
He is one of the speakers in both of the studies.
But you're passionate about it, right?
Yes.
So that's
But
my
yes, I've had to learn it non-natively as an adult,
Yeah.
which is an ongoing project. A bit like French. I can read it with like 98% fluency,
But when you go there, can you talk to your father?
odd sentences if I have a second or two to plan it in advance in my head.
Yeah.
But conversationally, just can't think fast enough. Same with every language I've ever tried to learn, really.
And your mother is not
No,
not
she's from the mainland, so
okay.
she's not Gaelic.
And so between them, they don't speak that. They don't speak Gaelic, and then with your grandparents, you didn't speak. Your grandparents on your father's side don't speak it either.
Well, yeah, they did certainly.
They did?
My father's parents would have spoken far better Gaelic than English, probably.
Yeah. It's sort of like what happened to me with Yiddish. Because like I never spoke Yiddish, but it was close to me. My grandparents spoke it. Both my parents speak it, but they don't speak it between them.
Did you sort of passively pick up quite a bit of it as a
pretty
child?
sure, like not quite a bit. I picked up a little bit of it.
But your father is not.
I mean, he's pretty much as close to a native speaker as you can get today in the secular society, because there are like the religious Yiddish speakers, they are really native speakers. But it's not the same type of Yiddish as my father. My father's Yiddish is like the Yiddish of Jews from Eastern Europe, but with an Argentinian accent, like Argentinian accent.
Was it the same Yiddish?
The thing is that the Yiddish that is preserved today is very much influenced by the fact that it's spoken by religious people Hebrew words. And it really depends on where they live. The Yiddish of Antwerp is very different from the Yiddish of Jerusalem and the Yiddish of New York.
And yeah, it was very sort of insularized, these
Yeah,
communities.
and it's really hard to
Developing
study it
quite separate.
because they don't let people in.
You have to dress up.
You have to dress up, and there is one person who did this study, but she really pretended to be like a person interested in religion. Mhm.
But this doesn't work. I've seen at the video, I just want to comment.
Yeah, I think there's like few people more than a few people who become secular, who leave the religious word, and then you can work with them.
No, but it was worse.
Okay. And what else? Yeah, and so I learned this language alone, like with a book, and I can speak a little bit. And what I do with my parents, I read texts with them over the phone, on Skype. So,
That's a good idea.
because there's a literary tradition that's also dead with the Holocaust. So nobody writes in Yiddish anymore, except like Orthodox newspapers, and they write about Orthodox like religious stuff that don't teach. Okay, I think we can't wait for other people. So let's close the door to see if they get there.
Please, these are new research of yours?
No, well, some of it's fairly new research. Some of it is stuff from a few years ago.
Because I see the
No, the phonology paper is separate stuff to this, but morphology paper that I published a few weeks ago came out, forms the second half of this talk. And that's the same nasalization stuff that I was presenting on at MFM a few years ago. So.
Okay, so hi everybody. Today we have Donald Alasdair Morrison from the University of Manchester to talk to us about Scottish Gaelic. Take it away.
Hey, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for coming. So yes, I'm going to be talking about some of the work that I've been doing over the last few years on Scottish Gaelic, and going to be looking at two particular studies that I've been doing, and running together with a common theme of looking at the relationship between phonetic and phonological sound patterns in Scottish Gaelic. So, very briefly, I'm going to be looking at the data in terms of modularity. So, under the traditional generative linguistic view, we have phonological grammar and phonetic grammar. So, the phonological grammar acts upon discrete symbolic representations, so abstract symbols that don't directly represent a real physical event. And the phonological grammar is responsible for categorical sound patterns. And on the other hand, you've got the phonetic grammar, which is responsible for gradient sound patterns. And the phonetics acts on the output of the phonology. And critically, it's supposed to be blind to any lexical or morphological conditioning. So the phonetics just robotically spells out whatever is present in the discrete phonological surface representation and converts that into articulatory movements and so on. So the phonetics doesn't care whether a particular segment in the phonological representation is there because it was in the underlying form, or is there because it was put there by a phonological process, and so on. But there is plenty of evidence that things aren't quite as simple as that, and there is widespread evidence for lexical or morphological conditioning in phonetics. So we have things like gradient effects of usage factors such as lexical frequency. So it's well established that more frequent words differ in a gradient manner from less frequent words. So you can have two supposedly homophonous words, which are pronounced very slightly differently according to their frequency. So the phonetics appears to be sensitive to the lexical identity of a form. And we also have incomplete neutralization, which we will talk about a lot in the second part of the talk, because it will form the core of that study. So in incomplete neutralization, the phonetics appears to be sensitive to paradigmatic relationships between forms. So I'm going to be talking a lot about categoricity versus gradients as a diagnostic for phonological versus phonetic sound patterns. So you get categoricity versus gradients in the distributional sense, by which I mean how tokens are distributed in, say, acoustic space. So for instance, if you plot vowel tokens in F1, F2 space, are they distributed bimodally or unimodally? And Benwether-Sotero and Truesdale argue that a bimodal distribution of tokens can be taken to indicate the presence of two phonological categories in a speaker's grammar. So they cite evidence that children or infants, when exposed to a bimodal distribution, will learn two categories. Whereas if the distribution is unimodal, they will not, even if it is the same overall variance and so on.
Can you explain bimodal distribution and unimodal?
So bimodal distribution, if you look at it on a density plot or a histogram, you will have two peaks with a dip in the middle.
Okay. Yeah.
And a unimodal distribution, just normal. So, so we'll be looking at that kind of categoricity versus gradients in the first part of the talk, where I'm going to be looking at a study of various patterns of vowel orthography in Scottish Gaelic and determining whether they belong to the phonetics or the phonology. And you can also have categoricity versus gradients in the dynamic sense. So if you have a particular segment which has a particular acoustic or articulatory property, does that property remain constant throughout the duration of the segment, or does it change during the segment? So if you've a constant, if it's something like a formant value or tongue position or a rate of nasal airflow, if it's constant throughout the duration of the segment, then this is evidence that we have a segment that is categorically specified for some phonological feature. Whereas if it varies throughout the duration of the segment, then this would appear to be gradient co-articulation. So for instance, this particular formant value or something is affected towards the beginning or the end of the segment through co-articulation with an adjacent segment. Or you can also think about it as interpolation between two targets. So if you have one segment that's specified for this value and another segment that's specified for this value, and the segment in between is not specified, then you get a sort of slope in between. So that could be a formant value going through. So for instance, an H between vowels, between two different vowels, you find that the formants slope through the duration of the H as it transitions from one vowel to the other.
But if the two vowels are the same, it doesn't. There's no.
Exactly. Yeah. So if the two vowels are the same, then it can look the same as if it is categorically specified. So yes, this can be thought of in terms of plateau-like and cline-like patterns. So Cohn, in work on nasalization, identifies plateau-like patterns of nasal airflow throughout a segment, so constant throughout the segment, identifies that as phonological nasalization, and a cline-like pattern of nasal airflow, so it decreases during the segment or increases during the segment, that is gradient, phonetic nasalization. So today, in the second part of the talk, we're going to be using this particular diagnostic on patterns of vowel nasalization in Scottish Gaelic. So, this is the Hebrides, all of these islands here, off the west coast of Scotland, and we're going to be looking at the northern tip of the Isle of Lewis. So Scottish Gaelic is part of the Gaelic branch of the Celtic branch of Indo-European, closely related to Irish, spoken in Ireland, and Manx, until recently spoken in the Isle of Man, undergoing a revival effort there. So Gaelic is nowadays confined mostly to the Hebrides, especially the Outer Hebrides, and the sort of extreme northwest fringes of the Highlands. There were apparently 60,000 speakers recently, according to census data, but it's undergone rapid decline since the early 20th century. So 100 or so years ago, it was a couple of 100,000, the number of speakers, when it was at its peak. So we're now zooming in on the northernmost island of the Outer Hebrides there. There's one island. It doesn't have a name. The northern three quarters is called Lewis, and the southern quarter is called Harris. They're traditionally thought of as two different islands, mostly because there's a sort of mountainous area between them here. So traditionally, communication between them would have been by sea. So for all intents and purposes, they were practically two different islands. So there's been a few studies on Gaelic dialects spoken in Lewis. So Borgstrom in 1940 did a very detailed survey of the dialect of Bernera, which is this little island just off the west side here. But he also had a few brief notes on Ness in the far north, just a few pages detailing some of the ways in which the Ness dialect differed from that of Bernera. Then Oftedal provides a very detailed survey of the dialect of Lurbost down in the east coast. Then more recently, Ladefoged et al. Revisit the dialect of Bernera and do an instrumental study of various aspects of the sound system of Bernera. So that largely agrees with Borgstrom's findings and so on, and they add to what we know about that particular dialect. And very recently, a few months ago, the IPA illustration for Scottish Gaelic was published by Nansen and O'Malley, which looks at, it's an overview of the sound inventory of one Ness speaker. And then you get a survey of the Gaelic dialects of Scotland, which consists of questionnaire data collected mostly during the 1950s and 60s from 207 speakers at 207 different locations throughout the traditionally Gaelic speaking areas of Scotland. And so there are several speakers from different parts of Lewis included in the SCIDS survey of the Gaelic dialects of Scotland. So the consonant system of Lewis Gaelic looks a bit like this. This is mostly true of all Gaelic dialects, or most Gaelic dialects, at least until recently. So you don't need to commit all of this to memory for the duration of the talk, but there are a few important things to note. So we have a series of aspirated stops. They are post-aspirated in initial position, but in non-initial position, they are pre-aspirated. So they have an H-like period of glottal frication before the stop closure. We also have, common with Irish, series of non-palatalized and palatalized consonants. So in Gaelic, that only exists in the coronals and dorsals. There is debate over whether the same contrast exists in labials. Just depends on what level you're looking at. I would also argue that underlyingly, yes, there's the same contrast in labials, but that's a completely different story. The palatalization on these two is very weak, so they could legitimately be transcribed without the palatalization diacritic, but phonologically, they are very clearly part of the palatalized series. That'll briefly become relevant later on. We also have a few velarized coronal sonorants there, which will also become relevant later on. In Lewis, when the velarized N is in initial position, the velarization tends to be weak or even non-existent. So for some speakers, it appears to be completely merged with a non-velarized one in initial position. And finally, we have a series of velarized retroflex consonants, which are usually considered for cross-dialectal and historical reasons to represent underlying clusters of rotate plus ordinary coronal, much like in Swedish and Norwegian.
Just one thing, so the is a rod?
Yes, so in most dialects, it's some kind of palatalized R. In Lewis, it is a dental fricative. It's sort of characteristic feature of the Lewis dialect. Somehow or other, the palatalized R has become dentalized. And the same thing I discovered by chance actually happens in the Jériet dialect spoken in Jersey. So an R is realized as a dental fricative in a palatalized environment. So I think it's just in the Wikipedia page on Jersey or something, there's a war memorial with inscribed with Libethes, Libede, with a the for the R in a frontal environment. So it's not just Lewis Gaelic that does it.
Does it pattern as a rhotic?
Sorry?
Does it pattern with other rhotics?
Yes, in terms of phonotactics and alternation. So it alternates with this because you have palatalization alternations stem finally. So it clearly belongs to the rhotic series phonologically.
It patterns that means that it's a sonorant or I mean, okay.
You definitely count as a sonorant in terms of phonological system.
Maybe approximate would be a better.
Yes, actually, and very often this realization is probably more approximate like inflective like, so perhaps there should be a down back diacritic there, but it's usually just transcribed as the fricative, with or without explicitly marking the palatalization. Okay, so that was the consonants. Lewis Gaelic vowels. Again, this is generally common to Gaelic dialects in general. You're gonna start off with a sort of Italian style 7-vowel system and add 2 unrounded back vowels. We've also got some opening diphthongs and various closing diphthongs ending in E and U. The exact inventory of closing diphthongs varies according to precise dialect, even within Lewis. There's no point in trying to list them all. Well-known characteristic of the Lewis dialect is that the close back rounded vowel has a true back allophone oo next to velarized consonants, but elsewhere it is very much fronted to a central oo. And the difference is extremely striking auditorily, and it's been confirmed instrumentally in a couple of studies and so on. And what will become very important in the second part of the study, vowels may be nasalized, especially next to nasal consonants. And so we'll find out more about that in more detail later on. So this is Ness. This is what it looks like. It's very nice. You should visit. Although it doesn't usually look like this, it's usually raining. So this is the northern part of the Isle of Lewis. If you look very, very closely, that tiny blip on the horizon, a mile or two away, is the lighthouse, which sits at the very, very northern tip. That hole in the rock is where apparently the Vikings tied their ropes when they tried to tow the island with them back to Norway. It didn't work. So, northernmost part of Lewis, Ness is basically a dense cluster of around 14 villages. They're mostly strung along a main road, sort of southwest and northeast direction. So the main road comes up the west coast, sort of diagonally, and the villages are strung along that. And yeah, for about 6 kilometers, roughly. Population fewer than 1,000, although a bit over 100 years ago, it was several times that, but fewer than 1,000 now. So now zooming in even more, so onto the Gaelic spoken in Ness specifically. So the consonant system differs very little from the general Lewis system that I've just outlined, except that non-initial velarized N may actually be retroflexed for some speakers. Certainly, one of my speakers, who happens to be my father, he does it a lot. I've never really noticed it very much with anybody else, so I don't know how idiolectal it is. But even though it's never been explicitly commented on before in the literature, except in the SCIDS data, if you look at the data points for two nearby parts of Lewis, it is occasionally transcribed as retroflex there. So it has been transcribed before nearby. More importantly, especially for the first part of the talk, the vowel system differs in various ways from the general Lewis system. So as Borgström reported in his notes on this, the short, close back unrounded vowel is merged with the close front vowel. Details are slightly different in what I observe from what Borgström observes, because for Borgström, it's actually not in all environments that this merger occurs, but for me, I would say it is in all environments. And the open mid and close mid front vowels, long, are merged, and that's in agreement with the IP illustration that Nancy O'Malley published last year.
The result of the merger was
A. So yes, A becomes A.
But that's only in long vowels, and the first merger is only in short vowels or in all?
This one's only in short vowels. This one's only, well, this is in long vowels, but you're about to find out what happens with short vowels. So yes, in short, the short close front vowel, there is this tense lax opposition where in certain consonantal environments, the vowel is sort of retracted and lowered towards a sort of near close, near front position. Borgström mentions this as being particularly strong in Ness, although the exact conditioning environments don't quite agree with what I see. And we also have a very similar opposition in the mid vowel. So we'll find out details about that in a minute. And we've also got retraction of the low vowel next to velarized consonants, which Borgström also points out as a specific characteristic of the Ness dialect. So the first study we're going to be looking at is work carried out over the last couple of years, looking at these various patterns of allophony in the Ness Gaelic system. So, looking at tense and lax I, for numerous Scottish Gaelic dialects, it has been reported there's some kind of allophony where you have some sort of retracted and lowered allophone in certain environments, although the exact environment varies quite a lot between different dialects, different reports. It's especially common before certain non-palatalized consonants. That's something that's quite common to all of these studies, but yes, it's very variable. But Borgström picks out Ness as being somewhere where this is particularly striking. And it's never been investigated instrumentally for any dialect before. So I'm going to be looking at that in the Ness dialect. So the rule is you have the tense E in what I will refer to as environment A. So there's two parts. First of all, it's tense when word finally or before hiatus, H, or a pre-aspirated stop. So you have tense E in Fioch before hiatus, Fiath before H, Mithak before pre-aspirated stop, or Ni or finally. And it's also tense before most palatalized consonants. Not including these two, which are the ones which where the palatalization is actually very, very weak, even though in most respects they do clearly pattern with the palatalized series. So we have palatalization, we have tense I in Vish, Dinya, Giga, Greek. And it's lax in what I'll call environment B, so I'm transcribing that as non-peripheral, near close, near front. So it's something like I. So you get the lax allophone in Fis, Shit, Milish, Tirich. So the tense allophone in quality resembles the long I, so it resembles E, except it's just shorter. whereas the lax allophone is retracted and lowered. And it actually tends to be quite similar in quality to the close back unrounded vowel, which is itself really more central in Lewis. It's so it's sort of close mid-central if you're being really, really strict about where it is. But the lax allophone of I can be quite similar to that in quality. So, although I did say that that vowel doesn't exist in ness because it is merged with that, it is the case that the lax allophone of that may resemble the close back unrounded vowel in other dialects. There is a bit of a complication there. But in the context of the next ness system, I view it as tense and lax allophones of this, rather than there's not a contrast between this and this. The precise conditioning may vary a little bit. So the rule I just gave seems to be fairly generally accurate, although there are some lexical items which seem to vary between speakers. And anecdotally, it seems that the lax allophone may be more common in the northeast end of Ness. So there's a few lexical items that have the lax allophone in the northeast and the tense allophone in the southwest end. And one speaker who was speaking to me about this and was consciously aware of this variation, he associated it with the catchment areas of the two primary schools that until recently served Ness. So you could tell whether somebody went to Lionel School or Cross School by whether they say mil for honey or mil, or Ministjath for minister or Ministjath. So now for tense and lax E. Yes, I'm going to say things like E when I mean that vowel. Don't let the language barrier confuse us too much. Tense and lax mid vowel. In most dialects of Scottish Gaelic, it's generally said that we have a contrast between close mid and open mid, A and E. Although the functional load is very low, it's very hard to find minimal pairs, but in some dialects you can find minimal pairs. And the contrast is neutralized in some environments. So for instance, Borgström says that in between two palatalized consonants, you can only ever get the close mid one, or before certain non-palatalized consonants, you can only ever get the open mid one. But there's no simple rule. So O'Malley tries to reduce them to a single phoneme using Oftedal's data and concludes that you can't. You would have to basically come up with a rule for every single lexical item, because there happen to be no precise minimal pairs, so you can always just formulate a new rule to deal with every single exception. So you cannot reduce them to a single phoneme in general. However, in this, what I find is that there's actually a very straightforward complementary distribution. And this has never been reported before for any dialect at all. So the rule in Ness is that you have the tense allophone in what I call environment A, or finally, or before hiatus H sharp reaspirated stop. So you have the tense allophone in Kehith before H, Fake before reaspiration, Seoch before hiatus, or Che, or finally, and the lax allophone before any other consonant, as in Ben.
Is it nasal?
Yes. Oops, I've spelled that wrong. That's supposed to be F-A-I-C. Yeah, so there's a nasalized vowel there.
Wow.
That's one of those non-etymological nasalized vowels that doesn't really have any right to be there. So yes, lax in Ben, Jedug, Elam, and Chess. So you'll notice that these two environments are almost exactly the same as the rule for tense and lax I, except that I had the additional requirement that it's always tense before a palatalized consonant. Apart from that, it's the same rule. So the tense allophone resembles in quality the long A vowel. The lapse allophone is retracted and lowered, just a bit further down the front diagonal. There, but because in the long vowels E is merged with A, there is no long E to compare it to. It's so retracted that it appears to merge with the mid back unrounded vowel for some speakers. Just another added complication. There are a lot of extra added complications that sneak in whenever you try to do any kind of work on Gaelic vowels. So yeah, this particular merger, Morrison reports it only before G. So we also have retraction of the open vowel. So the long or short open vowel is retracted from a sort of central or even front position to a fully back position next to velarized consonants. And this is a characteristic of Ness that Borgström mentions in his notes. And so it's actually quite parallel to the allophony that I mentioned that we have in U throughout Lewis. So a characteristic of Lewis in general is that U is retracted to U in velarized consonant environments. Similarly, A is retracted to A in similar environments in Ness.
When you say next to is either before or after?
Either before or after, yes. So we have retraction. So there's a short vowel. We have retraction next to velarized consonants, excluding the initial velarized N, where remember the velarization is extremely weak, usually. So before N in Fanich, Ganoch, before the velarized L in Baloch, Gal, after the velarized L, Blas, Pladoch, before the velarized R, Yarok, Starok, after the velarized R, Rak, Rakoch, and before those velarized retroflex consonants that you get from underlying rhotic plus coronal clusters, as in Ashbach and Charsht. And similarly with the long vowel, same story. No examples known of the long vowel before the velarized N. I think this is an accidental gap for historical reasons that I'm not entirely sure about. I think if you look in a dictionary, you can find potential examples, but good luck trying to elicit them from a random native speaker. So before velarized L and Al and Sal, after it, and Bla, Lajith, before the velarized R and Bar, Garu, after the velarized R, Rakan, Gran, and before a velarized retroflex consonant, as in Gardan and Yarlach. Another environment where this retraction can appear. Sorry? Easy, yes. There is another environment where this retraction can appear though. So in Lewis, the cluster of velar fricative plus stop and pre-aspirated velar stop are normally distinct. So you have contrast between these middle pairs, shach and shach, tach and tach. Some Ness speakers actually merge both to the pre-aspirated one. And when they do this, they retract the vowel, it seems. So you have some sort of weird transphonologization going on here, where you have speakers that merge the cluster but retract the vowel, so you have a contrast between shach and shach, tach and tach. So that is one other retracting environment that we'll briefly see later on.
One of them is the A environment, right? And the other one is not. Environment A, right? So the wither is environment A before an H, before pre-aspirated consonant.
Yes, in terms of the rule for tense and lax I and E, but in general, I mean, you don't also get this allophony before hiatus, word finally, and so on. Yeah. So no, I don't think there's any connection there. Yes, I know no examples of long vowel before this cluster, so I can't tell if it retracts there as well. So on to the actual experiment that I'm going to be talking about. The aims are, well, first of all, just to document the vowel system in Gaelic, because it has not been documented in a huge amount of detail yet in terms of these allophonic processes. I'm only going to look at the unrounded vowels because the rounded vowels are pretty boring. They basically just follow the general Lewis pattern. The retraction of U to U occurs in 1 or 2 additional environments in this, but we won't be looking at that today. So yes, I want to acoustically verify these allophonic patterns that I have just very confidently told you exist. So obviously, because the lax I and E are retracted and lowered relative to the tense ones, we predict that they'll produce that they will show higher F1 and lower F2. Yes, that's right around in environment B when they're lax than in environment A when they're tense. And the open vowel is predicted to show lower F2 in retracting environments than non-retracting environments. And because I'm wanting to look at which part of the grammar these sound patterns belong to, I'm going to try and establish whether they are distributed bimodally in vowel space. And as I said, following Bermudez, Otero, and Truesdale, I'm going to take bimodal distribution to indicate the presence of 2 phonological categories in a speaker's grammar. So I recruited 9 speakers born between 1943 and 1984, of whom only 3 are related to me. 6 male, 3 female, and I have a word list of 144 stimuli containing these vowels containing every unrounded vowel except for the close, mid, back unrounded one, because it's quite hard to work with because the short one is lexical incidence is really variable. So you'll have some words where just some people randomly use this vowel instead of a or something. And the long one is just quite rare. So I would have great difficulty finding enough stimuli to actually be able to say anything about it. You can only think of half a dozen words that actually have that vowel. Carrier sentence was she echanas me. Literally, it is that I will say. While it may seem slightly clumsy in English, this kind of clefting structure is incredibly common and natural in Gaelic. And each was repeated 3 times in succession. She ex echanas me, she ex echanas me, she ex echanas me, she y echanas me, she y echanas me, and so on. Except not usually quite as fast. Successfully obtained 3,865 tokens of the target vowels and extracted F1 and F2 values at the midpoints of these vowels, normalized using the S-centroid method following Fabricius et al. And in order to quantify tenseness, because the lapsed vowels, tense and lapsed vowels are separated diagonally in vowel space, in order to quantify some measure of tenseness, you need to take into account both F1 and F2. So you can define tenseness for a particular vowel phoneme, I or E, as some constant A times F1 minus F2. So basically, without going into too much detail, I found the value of A for I and for E. I find the value of A that minimize the variance in the 2 environments relative to the overall variance, so that you have the most intuitively meaningful measure of tenseness. So there's a particular value of A for I tenseness and a particular value of A for E tenseness. So yes, optimal A calculated for these 2 vowels. And then used LME modeling to establish whether these allophonic patterns could be confirmed to exist, and Hartigan's dip test to see if I could confirm the presence of bimodality in distribution. So the vowel system looks like this. Again, it's just the unrounded vowels and also excluding the close mid back unrounded vowel. So this is the short vowels on the left, long vowels on the right. You can clearly see, well, probably not very clearly because it's extremely blurry. I in environment A is very peripheral, similar part of the vowel space to the long I, whereas I in environment B is heavily centralized and occupies a similar area of vowel space to the close back unrounded vowel. Similarly, you have E in environment A, far further up the front diagonal than E in environment B. And for the open vowel in both short and long, you have a difference between non-retracted and retracted environments. So in the retracted environment is further back.
So the AO is the unrounded mid-back vowel?
Unrounded close back vowel.
Close back.
Yeah. I would have used the IPA symbols on the chart, but I kept running into problems when I tried to have both subscripts and Unicode characters on a ggplot chart. So I had to just give up. So I'm using orthographically. So this is what the distribution of tokens of I looks like for these 9 speakers. So the red squares are environment A and the blue triangles are environment B. So there's a very clear tendency for the blacks one, for the ones in environment B to be retracted and somewhat lowered relative to the tense ones. And these grey lines represent reference values for tenseness. So the particular value of optimal value of A that I calculated for I at tenseness measuring how far they are in precisely this dimension.
Speakers 3 and 7 don't show a diagonal, right?
3 and oh yes, yeah. There's very little.
Like there's this more.
It's almost totally horizontal. Yeah, it's almost exclusively retraction for them. Yeah.
But none shows.
No. But yeah, so some of them look somewhat bimodal, some of them less so. This is what they look like if you plot T tenseness as it has been defined. Very clearly, the tokens environment A tend to be more tense than the tokens environment B. So tenseness is increasing on the left, to the left. So yes, I fitted an LME model for what I call I tenseness, fixed effect of environment, whether it's environment A or environment B, random intercepts in speaker and stimulus, random slope in speaker by environment. All of these significantly improve the fit of the model. And we can see that environment B very clearly, very significant effect whereby tenseness is lower in environment B than in environment A. So we can confirm that there is an effect there. This is what the density distributions of the tokens looks like with respect to tenseness. So the environment A is the red dotted line, environment B is the blue dashed line, and the gray, solid gray line is the overall distribution. So first step is to identify just visually which ones show evidence of bimodality. So if we define bimodality, or at least bimodality that is relevant to what we're looking for, as a pronounced dip in the overall distribution near to the point where the individual density distributions cross. So we clearly have a visibly bimodal distribution here, for instance, because in between the two individual distributions, at the point where their density distributions cross, you have a pronounced dip in the overall distribution. That is true for all of them except for S2 and S3. So Next, see if this can actually be confirmed statistically for any of the 7 speakers who show visible evidence of bimodality. Because I'm doing multiple comparisons, I corrected for this using the Bonferroni method, not to be confused with the Bonferroni method, which is slightly cruder and extremely conservative, so far more prone to type 2 errors. So Bonferroni method is slightly more sophisticated, stepwise way to illuminate null hypotheses. And it turns out that of those 7 speakers who show visible evidence of bimodality, only one of them, it actually works out significant once you correct for multiplicity. Even though 4 of them before this correction are significant beyond the 0.05 level, only one of them survives the correction. So I would suspect, I'd like to say that several of them are probably real effects, but can only confirm that for one of them. So the next question is for those speakers with 2, at least, putative categories, so those 7 speakers that showed visible evidence of bimodality, do all of the items fall into the expected category? Are all lexical items on the expected side of the dip, according to the rule that I gave earlier? And there are a few individual lexical items that show a little bit of variation. So gimoch, meaning lobster, is tense for speaker S6 instead of lax. Milk is tense for 4 of the speakers. Drich is lax for 2 of the speakers. And Dinje and Tieg are lax for 1 of the speakers. So those all break the rule that I gave earlier. This is largely consistent with the claim that one of the speakers made, that the lax allophone is more common at the northeast end of S. So S6 is from the southwest end and has unexpected tenseness. S4, 6, and 8 from the southwest end, and they have unexpected tenseness in mir instead of mil. S9 is not from the southwest end. For Brich, which is unexpectedly lax for S1 and S7, they are both from the northeast end. And I don't know why S4 has unexpected laxness here, but largely consistent. But we need a lot more data, a lot more stimuli in order to sort of refine the rule for those speakers who show this variation. We need to look at dozens of different environments in order to work out exactly what different rules these speakers might have. So now for tense and lax E. Same idea. This time the slopes of the tenseness contours are slightly different because the optimal value of that constant A turned out differently. So again, some look a little bit more bimodal than others. Some don't look remotely bimodal. So this is plotting just tenseness, and very clearly there is strong tendency for it to be tenser in environment A in red than in environment B in blue for all speakers. So again, I fitted an LME model for E tenseness, same fixed effect, same random effects. Again, it was the same ones which turned out to significantly improve the fit of the model. And once again, very significant effective environment, where environment B tenseness is lower. So once again, it is definitely a real effect. And this is what the density distributions look like. So once again, environment A is the red dotted line, environment B is the blue dashed line, and some of them look very nice and bimodal, some of them don't. So S1, 2, 4, 5, 7, and 8 all show very clear, visible evidence of bimodality. S3, 6, and 7 are basically unimodal. So, of those 6 speakers who look bimodal, how many of them pass the test? Once again, corrected for multiplicity in the same way. 3 of the 6 come up as fairly significantly bimodal. So, of those 6 speakers with 2 at least putative categories, do all of the items fall into the expected category? Generally, yes, except S8, 2 of those items appear to be lax rather than tense. So there's some variation there. But once again, any attempt to refine the rule for this speaker and try and work out exactly which environments the speaker had the lax allophone in would require a lot more stimuli. This is completely cold now. I don't know why I'm still drinking it. So,
I'll bring you some water.
oh, thank you very much. Now moving on to the retraction of the open vowel. So this is the short open vowel. Again, you can clearly see that in non-retracting environments, which are the red squares, F2 tends to be higher. So it's fronter than in the retracting environments, which are the blue triangles. So there's a very, very clear, visible pattern there, although none of them look remotely bimodal. And this is what it looks like if you plot it as a box plot for each speaker. Again, nearly all retracting environments appear to have lower F2 than non-retracting environments. Some stronger than others. We'll find out about the cluster ones soon because they don't quite seem to cause the retraction we expect them to in some speakers. And notice so CHD is the orthographic label I'm using for the cluster. Because this is only a retracting environment for speakers that merge it with the pre-aspirated stop, I have only got tokens coded for this in speakers that merge it with the pre-aspirated stop. So only 4 speakers actually have this particular retracting environment. For speakers that don't have the merger, it's just a normal following, which doesn't cause retraction. If you're wondering why different speakers have different environments there. So, same thing again, I fit in LME model for this time F2 of the short vowel. Fixed effects, thank you very much, for the various environments. So non-retracting versus each of these individual retracting environments. And same random effects as before. And the result looks like this. So in every single case, apart from the cluster, we have a highly significant, or at least fairly significant effect whereby F2 is lower than these retracting environments, except it doesn't quite reach significance at the 0.05 level for speakers who merge the cluster with the pre-aspirated stop and enter retracting vowel. So it doesn't actually quite reach significance there. So this is the density distributions of the short vowel. When we saw the scatter plots a minute ago, we saw that none of them looked clearly bimodal. And indeed, when you look at the density distributions, there is no clear bimodality at all. Some of them are a little bit wobbly. I mean, that one, almost a tiny bit of potential bimodality there, but no, none of them, I would say, at all are clearly bimodal. So no speakers appear to show any evidence of two separate phonological categories for the retraction of the short open vowel. Now, remember I said a wee while ago that among speakers who have this merger, they retract the open vowel. So that tak, which is tak for other speakers, tak is distinct from tak because it has this underlying cluster which has been merged with the Gaelic stop. So it turns out that among the four speakers who do this, who have this merger, the retraction of the preceding vowel is actually very inconsistent. So I was lying when I said that this thing happens.
We're in line.
It happens sometimes, yes. Of those four speakers, only S5 has a clearly audible distinction between, so it is on the recordings, only S5 is a clearly audible distinction between shach, and between tak and tak, which are the minimal pairs that appeared in the word list. S1 audibly distinguishes only one of the minimal pairs, distinguishes tak from tak. But S1 pronounces shach, the same as shach, which is weird because S1 is my father. And the reason I first came to notice this particular phenomenon a few years ago is because my father kind of corrected my pronunciation of shach and said, no, it's shach, it's different from shach. But in the recording, he doesn't actually make that distinction. So there seems to be some variability there. He sometimes makes a distinction, but didn't on the recording. And for S7 and 8, there is no audible difference between them. I'm talking about just auditory impression here because there's far too few tokens to actually do any kind of formal analysis of these for individual speakers. So yes, any kind of systematic investigation of this particular retraction will require a lot more data, which will mean forcing lots and lots of people to read some obscure, some less obscure words and see how they pronounce them, without them all hypercorrecting to the more standard form where the cluster is not merged. So now we're on to the long open vowel. This is what they look like distributed in vowel space. So clear tendency for the non-retracted environments to have higher F2 for the front than the retracted environments. Some of them are more bimodal than others. I think we should all just take a minute to appreciate my uncle's commitment to the cause of keeping these two allophones separate. That is literally the most spectacular bimodal distribution I've ever seen in linguistics. This is.
They like to pronounce.
Well, my uncle certainly has some very, very strong. I think it's more that he sort of fronts the non-retracted one a bit more than other people, but it's incredibly consistent and not a single token breaks the rule.
How old is he?
How old?
Yeah.
Late 60s, I guess.
Whereas your father, who is his
S1,
brother,
yeah,
is not as
not nearly as bimodal. And there's a third sibling there. My aunt is S7, and again, fairly bimodal, but not nearly as neat. This is what it looks like. A box plot. So we do not include the environment before the velarized N here, because remember, there just don't seem to be any words with the long A before velarized N. And we also don't have the environment before the cluster, because again, I don't know of any words, suitable words. So again, we can very clearly see that in every single retracting environment, we seem to have more back vowel than in the retracting, non-retracting environment. So again, same drill, LME model, same fixed effects, same random effects, and highly significant in every single one of those retracting environments. So the density distributions. Just like with tense and lax I and E, we have some that look quite bimodal and some that don't at all. So S1, 2, 4, and 7 have clear visible bimodality here. S3 is beautifully unimodal. S5, 6, 8, 9, slightly wobbly, but still not any clear bimodality going on there. So just S1, 2, 4, and 7 are clearly bimodal, especially S2, where the dip is pretty much zero.
Are these the same speakers that show the bimodality in the short vowel?
In the short vowel, none of them show bimodality. But whether it's the same speakers that showed bimodality in tense and lax IE, no, there's no obvious pattern. It's not like the people who are bimodal in tense and lax I are also bimodal in tense and lax E. There's no pattern like that, as far as I can tell.
People like bimodality and other.
No. Unfortunately, it'd be nice if I could say that, but no, it seems to be fairly random which speakers show bimodality for which patterns. So, Hartigan slip test again, corrected in the same way. Two of those four come out as extremely significant. I suppose S2 is a bit of a sanity check, because if S2 didn't come out as significant, then we would know that there was something wrong with the test. So, same question again, for those speakers who have two putative categories, do all items fall into the expected category? Well, generally, yes, except there are just some items which display a bit of inconsistency. There's a bit of a sort of overlap in the distributions of the two environments. Mostly, it's in items where it's next to a velarized R or before a retroflex, where a retraction appears to be a little bit weaker than in the other retraction environments. So, to sum up what we have found so far, tense and lax, i.e. significantly greater tenseness in environment A than environment B. Several speakers display visible bimodality, of which a subset can be confirmed statistically. And there are some lexical items which vary between speakers. I've been sort of implicitly assuming so far that when we see this variation, it's grammatical, because some speakers just have a slightly different version of the rule. But it could be the case that some speakers have actually lexicalized the opposition. So it's no longer rule-based, and we have some kind of phonemic split going on here. That could be the case for some of the speakers which show this categorical distribution, but some items are just not on the side we expect them to be. So that is a possibility. As for the open vowel, it displays significantly lower F2 in all retracting environments, except for the merged cluster, relative to non-retracting environments. But no speakers display any evidence of bimodality in the short vowel. Several do in the long vowel, of which, again, for a subset, we can confirm it statistically. So, what is going on here? I choose to look at this pattern of variation in terms of the life cycle of phonological processes. So this refers to the way in which sound patterns can be said to follow a fairly regular diachronic trajectory over time through the grammar of speakers from generation to generation. So sound patterns begin their lives as totally universal, articulatory, auditory, or perceptual biases. And at some point, these become phonologized, which means that they enter the phonetic grammar. There is a story, I think, behind the extremely counterintuitive use of the word phonologization to refer to this stage. Ricardo explained the history behind the terminology to me once, but I can't remember it. So that's the terminology we're stuck with. Phonologization is when it enters a phonetic grammar. So what happens is that these, the effects of these universal biases get reanalyzed by the learner as reflecting an actual grammatical process under cognitive control of the speaker. So the learner encodes them in the grammar. The next stage is stabilization, which is when the sound pattern advances into phonology. So after phonologization, once we have a phonetic rule in the grammar, if two particular environments, the distribution of tokens happens to get far enough apart that we get some sort of emergent bimodality, a learner will reanalyze that as reflecting two discrete phonological categories. As I mentioned earlier, with Alasdair and Truesdale, cite evidence that a learner exposed to a bimodal distribution will learn two discrete categories. So stabilization is when some sort of chance emergent bimodality in a speaker gets reanalyzed by the learner as part of the phonological grammar. And the ultimate destination of these sound patterns will be morphologization or lexicalization. So we can say that it looks like because of the variation that we're finding between speakers, these various allophonic patterns in this are currently undergoing stabilization in the community. So some speakers have passed that stage, whereas other speakers are at an earlier diachronic stage still.
I have a question.
And I should have removed those bracket speakers. Yeah. It's just the long vowel. The short vowel doesn't. The short vowel is still in the phonetic grammar.
If it's in the phonetic grammar, then it doesn't always happen. That's the point. But can you go back to the preceding fact? So, say the short vowel, the fluctuations in their pronunciation, that's undergoing phonologization.
Well, it has already undergone phonologization. It's already part of phonetic grammar, we would assume, because it's not a completely language universal thing. Yeah. Before phonologization, we're just talking about completely universal co-articulatory effects that happen in every single language.
But so when something has undergone phonologization, it doesn't need to be ubiquitous. So the idea is that, sometimes you will see it, some other times you won't, because it's part of the phonetic grammar.
It can be variable and importantly is gradient, but it's whether it's optional is a different story. Because I mean, it could be an optional phonetic rule, but the idea is that is there encoded in the phonetic grammar. It happens, but it's gradient.
In the context of vowel solutions, that stabilization distribution, and does lexicalization mean that the context is not there and you just have to acquire a specific vowel for specific items in that context?
Yeah, so stabilization means we now have a categorical distribution of tokens, so we can say it's a phonological rule. Yeah, but it's still context dependent. Undergoes morphologization, it may become sensitive to morphemic boundaries and so on. And lexicalization, you have two contrastive phonemes because there is no conditioning environment left.
So if I understand this correctly, the idea is that when something is phonologized, as in phonologization, it comes to be part of the language-specific set of instructions that is given to the articulate.
Yes.
Right?
Exactly.
Now, because the articulators are articulators, they don't always finally reach that. They don't always obey that thing, and that's why you get this variation.
Yes.
Language specific.
Yes.
Okay. And stabilization will be more stable because it's like already the inputs to that thing, to the phonologization, the inputs to the articulatory set of instructions is already different.
Yeah.
It's not the same.
Although it's not strictly about obligatoriness versus optionality, because it can be stabilized yet still be an optional phonological rule.
Yeah.
You can have an optional phonological rule where you can either have it appearing as two different categories or not. So it's not necessarily about
Okay,
no
so
longer
I
being
don't know
optional.
which one, right?
Or yes, ultimately you can have exceptions once it progresses.
Did you just look at one as two, or you say you took into account other parameters like stress, for instance, that also affect duration, so that's necessary?
So I forgot to mention, every single vowel we're going to talk about in this entire presentation is a stressed vowel. So in Scottish Gaelic, the stress is on the initial syllable, and we're only looking at the vowel of the initial syllable. So only stressed vowels. Duration will come up in a moment, though. So I want to have a wee think about the potential phonetic grounding for this tense lax allophony in I and E, because with the retraction of the open vowel, it seems to be straightforward co-articulation. You have lowering of F2 in a velarized environment. That's fairly a fairly psychologically normal thing to do. But what about with tense and lax I and E? So remember that the rule for I and E is the same, except that for I, there's this overriding requirement that it's tense before a palatal one. That bit is probably just straightforward co-articulation. Tense I is in a more close front position, so it anticipates the close front tongue position of a following palatal consonant. So if we set that aside and think about the remainder of the rule that applies to both I and E is that they are tense word finally or before hiatus H or a pre-aspirated stop, and lax elsewhere. So does it have something to do with duration? Because we know that in some languages you have a tense lax opposition that shadows vowel length. So in English and German, long vowels are tense and short vowels are lax, roughly speaking. So is it the case that I and E are longer in environment A than environment B? We would still have to then ask why they are longer in those environments, but this would be a step on the way to finding out why they are tense in environment A. If they're longer in environment A, then it's fairly natural they will be tense in environment A, because greater duration means more time to get into the more peripheral extreme tongue position required for a tense vowel. But it doesn't matter because there is no significant correlation with duration. Tense I and E are not significantly longer than lax I and E in my data, so I don't think duration will get us anywhere. Going to run out of time, aren't I?
Yeah.
Okay, so now Storm has recently associated proposed that closed syllable laxing in languages such as French reflects conflicting strategies of contrast enhancement. So the story goes that because coda consonants don't have a clear release burst, the release is where most of the cues to consonantal place and so on are found. Because coda consonants tend to lack that, the perceptual distinctiveness of a coda consonant is heavily reliant on transitional cues at the VC boundary. And lax vowels, because they have higher F1, that means that they allow for more distinct formal transitions. And this means that laxing can serve to enhance the perceptual distinctiveness of a following coda consonant. So if you have a coda consonant, because it's in the coda, it is in desperate need of perceptual enhancement in order to cue things like place. Laxing the preceding vowel helps to enhance its distinctiveness. If there's no coda consonant in desperate need of enhancement, the vowel is tense by default because that maximizes the distinctiveness of the vowel itself. So is this in any way relevant to the Nescali pattern? Well, we're not looking at closed syllable laxing. That's not what we have in this. However, it is true that I and E are tense in exactly those cases when there is no direct transition between the vowel and the following supraglottal consonant. So their tense word finally, when there is no following consonant. Before hiatus, when there's no following consonant. Before H, when there is no immediately following consonant with any kind of oral place. And for a pre-aspirated stop, when there is an H-like period of pre-aspiration between the vowel and the onset of the closure. So there is no oral articulation immediately following the vowel. So it looks like laxing occurs only in those situations where this has the potential to enhance transitional cues to things like the place of the following consonant. So laxing doesn't occur in any of these environments because in those environments it would not have any benefit to the perceptual distinctiveness of the consonant. So if we look at the relationship between what happens in French and in Scottish Gaelic, in French, the perceptual distinctiveness of the vowel is sacrificed by laxing only for the benefit of a coda consonant. So only a coda consonant is felt to be in such dire need of this enhancement that we lax the vowel. Whereas in Nest Gaelic, we just go one step further. And any following consonant that may benefit from it triggers laxing of the vowel. So anytime there's a direct transition from the vowel to a following consonant, the vowel is laxed in order to enhance these perceptual cues to the things like place of the following consonant. And this would actually reflect a sort of much more general trend in both Gaelic and Irish, whereby over hundreds of years, there's been this general tendency for vocalic distinctions to be sacrificed for the benefit of consonantal distinctions. So, still have enough time to hopefully go through the second part of the talk.
Okay, just before you go to the second part of the talk, so the idea is, I understood the idea. Where does this happen? Where in the architecture of exteriorization does this happen?
So
is there like a contrast enhancing constraint in your, say, OT?
Well, we know that speakers will tend to use certain strategies like this in order to enhance contrasts, such as things like gradient lengthening of vowels before a voice stops and things like that. So this would reflect, this would tell us the original phonetic grounding for this particular rule. As for how it's actually encoded now synchronically in those speakers which have a phonological contrast, I haven't thought about exactly what the form of those constraints would be. So yeah, I haven't thought about exactly how it would be encoded in the phonological grammar now.
Yeah.
But this is my idea of how it would originally have come about as a phonetic process that eventually advanced up into the phonological grammar. Okay, so the second part is looking at work on vowel nasalization in Scottish Gaelic, specifically West Gaelic. So this study relates to incomplete neutralization. So we have a situation where we have final devoicing in languages like German, whereby we can tell from alternations that we have an underlying D in Vat meaning wheel and an underlying T in Vat meaning device, but on the surface they are supposedly homophonous because the final D is devoiced. But neutralization is often found to be incomplete. There's no point in citing studies because there are dozens and dozens of them. And what we find is that the devoiced consonants, like the underlying D in that, appear to retain certain analogues of properties usually associated with voice consonants. So you have subtly shorter closure duration, subtly longer preceding vowel duration, and so on. Crucially, those differences are small, gradient, and not readily perceptible. So until people actually did experimental work on this in the 1980s, phonologists thought that rat and rat were homophonous. It's only through experimentation, statistical analysis, that we find that if you take the average of dozens and dozens of tokens of each, you find that there's a slight difference of a few milliseconds on average between the durations of these neutralized segments. So this means that under a traditional view of phonology as acting upon discrete categorical symbols, you cannot assign these to different categories because you would have to have two phonological symbols in the surface representation whose phonetic interpretation was virtually identical, except a couple of milliseconds out on average.
But because it's said dozens of studies, I'm assuming that you're familiar with a couple of them.
Yes.
Do people do perception studies?
There are perception studies, and yes, when you force listeners to guess or try and work out which one is being produced, they do perform significantly better than chance. So just slightly better, but significantly better. So the difference is not readily perceptible. You can't hear a token and say, "Oh, that's the underlying voice one." But if you make people make the choice,
would say that's the underlying voice.
but or say,
That's
"Well,
wheel."
that's wheel," or "That's advice." But if you make people make the choice over a large number of tokens, you do find that there's a very, very slight above chance recognition of this difference.
Light is not good enough.
But it's significant.
Oh, sorry. So we can think of incomplete neutralization as a paradigm uniformity effect, and paradigm uniformity at the level of categorical phonology is quite uncontroversial. So, for instance, we have over-application of postnasal coda G deletion in English. In English, we have a rule whereby if you have a coda G after a nasal, it is deleted. So in sing, it is deleted, but in finger, it's not deleted because the G is in the onset. Because that's how it gets syllabified. But in singer, there is over-application of the deletion rule. Even though you'd expect it to be the same as finger, the G is deleted. And this is clearly related to the fact that it is paradigmatically related to sing. And this can be handled straightforwardly in a traditional straight modular architecture. You can do it through cyclicity and say that the deletion rule applies to the stem sing, and then you add the suffix. Or you can say that you have output-output correspondence constraints that enforce identity between paradigmatically related forms. And depending on how you rank those constraints relative to the constraints that are responsible for the rule itself, you may get paradigm uniformity effects like this. But critically, the phonetics remain sensitive only to the output of the phonology, so there's no problem. However, paradigm uniformity at the gradient phonetic level, such as incomplete neutralization, is a lot more problematic. There are various ways to handle it. You can say that output-output correspondence constraints may make reference to phonetic properties. Or you have exemplar theoretic approaches where you have a phonetically rich lexicon and base forms and inflected forms are stored together in the lexicon, and you have partial co-activation of paradigmatically related forms. So when you produce hat, meaning wheel, you have partial co-activation of the genitive hadus, meaning that this is a very slight effect on the production of the final obstruent. And these approaches are inherently non-modular because you lose the clear division between phonetics and phonology, and the phonetics displays sensitivity to morphological or lexical conditioning. Now, most work on incomplete neutralization focuses on processes such as final devoicing, what you're looking at is straightforwardly concatenative morphology. So you're looking at mostly Indo-European languages with you have a stem and a suffix, and final devoicing and some of the other processes that are often looked at are straightforwardly phonetically natural processes which serve to satisfy phonotactic constraints. So you have phonotactic constraint saying that you cannot have a voiced final obstruent. Very little work exists on processes which don't meet these criteria, such as the initial mutations that are best known from Celtic languages, but also exist in other languages scattered around the world. What we have in initial mutation is, instead of straightforward concatenative morphology, you have substitution of one segment for another. You can look at it concatenatively if you assume that what's happening is autosegmental affixation. You have some sort of feature bundle being affixed onto the initial consonant. And the other thing is that initial mutations are not phonotactically motivated. They are directly triggered by the morphology itself. The morphology says, change this segment into this segment. It's not like final devoicing, where the morphology says, add this suffix, and then in turn, phonotactics, that in turn feeds the phonotactically driven alternation in voicing. So the question I'm asking in this study is, can incomplete neutralization occur in connection with initial mutation? So initial mutation, some examples from Irish and Welsh. It can be exemplified quite nicely using possessive particles, because in all of the Celtic languages, the possessive particles can exemplify the full paradigm of mutations. So in Irish, you have the radical form in her cat, ekut, lenition in his cat, echut, and eclipsis in their cat, egut, where the k gets either fricated for lenition or voiced for eclipsis. And note that in these three cases, the only difference between those three possessive particles is the mutation that they trigger. Then in Welsh, you have the radical form in icath, their cat, soft mutation in igath, his cat, with voicing, nasal mutation in vinghath, my cat, with nasalization, and frication in the aspirate mutation, ichath, her cat. And you get a lot of neutralizations in the initial mutations. So just some examples. In Irish, but the g can represent radical but the g, or they are also the eclipsis grade of underlying radical k. Or in Welsh, v is a soft mutation grade of both underlying b and underlying m. So there's lots of neutralizations going on here. So there's been a few studies looking for incomplete neutralization in initial mutation. Arcangeli et al. Do an ultrasound tongue imaging study. Preliminary results from 3 speakers, Scottish Gaelic. They find some differences in tongue position between lenited consonants from different radical sources. But the stimulus pairs, I think, are very poorly matched for our following environment. So, for instance, they're looking at different tongue position in initial H, where that initial H is derived from lenition of T or lenition of S. Because it's an H, the tongue position is entirely dependent on the following vowel. The following vowel is matched, but the consonant after the vowel is not matched. So any slight co-articulatory effect that following consonant has on the tongue position in the vowel is going to be reflected in a difference in tongue position in the H. So I don't think the stimulus pairs they use are very reliably matched at all. Osishkin et al. Do a perception study. As part of a much broader psycholinguistic study, they test to see if speakers can distinguish F from radical F from F from lenition of P, and there's no significant difference. Welby et al. Do an acoustic study of eclipsis in Irish. They measure the usual things like closure, duration, and stuff like that. They do find greater burst intensity in voice stops from eclipses of voiceless stops than in voice stops representing radical voice stops. So this looks like a nice candidate for incomplete neutralization. Greater burst intensity is something you'd associate with voiceless stops, and we have some subtle analog of this appearing in the voice stops that are derived from voiceless stops. However, there's a very serious confound in their experiment. Because of the way they elicit the tokens, they're always preceded by the definite article. The definite article in Irish, optionally, may or may not have a final nasal. And just somehow, because of the structures that they use to elicit the tokens, it turns out that in the eclipsis tokens, the eclipsis tokens are almost always preceded by the endless allophone of the article, allomorph, and the radical tokens are nearly always preceded by the allomorph with the N. And they are unable to control for this because it's such a huge difference in the frequency of the two allomorphs of the article in these two conditions. So the fact that you have slightly more voiceless-like voiced stops in the eclipsis context could be because they are not preceded by an N in the eclipsis tokens, whereas they're nearly always preceded by N in the radical tokens. And finally, venturing out with Celtic, we have similar initial mutation processes in some Austronesian languages like Javanese and Sasak. Arcangeli et al. Find no significant differences, and Seifert et al. On Javanese find no significant differences. So in Gaelic, stressed vowels may be phonemically nasalized. So in these words, you can see from the orthography that historically there was a nasal consonant there that has been deleted or fricated, and so on. In all of these cases, we have a nasal vowel in a non-nasal environment. Stressed vowels are usually nasalized after nasal consonants, such as mati, mahith, miar, mias, but you do get some words where this nasalization doesn't occur. So you have non-nasalized vowel in marak, marogan, marai, mili. There's no rule to predict when this blocking will occur. Oftedal notes certain tendencies, so it's frequently blocked next to rhotics or in Sfarabhakti groups, which are VCV sequences with special prosodic properties. Of the 4 blocking items I just showed you, 1 of them is next to a rhotic, 2 of them it's both next to a rhotic and in a Sfarabhakti group, but 1 of them it meets neither of those conditions. So there's no hard and fast rule. So the way I'm going to view it chronologically is that we have a default rule that spreads plus nasal from the M onto a following vowel. And this is occasionally blocked by lexically specific marking of minus nasal in the underlying form. This way we get a nice symmetry between the occasional lexically specific plus nasal in non-nasal environments. So in most lexical items, the vowel is not underlyingly specified, but occasionally in non-nasal environments, you have an exceptional plus nasal item, and occasionally in nasal environments, you have an exceptional minus nasal. You could also just say that nasalization is lexical in every single case. It's not of any major consequence. What's crucial is that I'm going to be saying that forms like matin, the vowel is nasalized in the phonological representation, in the surface representation. So in a pilot study, I found that items that follow a default pattern, like matin, have sustained nasal airflow throughout the vowel. Plateau-like pattern where it's blocked. Items like marak have rapidly decreasing airflow early in the vowel. And following Cohn, who does a lot of work on nasalization in English and other languages, I take this to represent categorical phonological nasalization versus gradient phonetic nasalization. Phonological nasalization may be blocked in words like marak, but when that happens, phonetic nasalization still occurs because phonetic nasalization should be blind to any lexical or morphological conditioning, so it occurs exceptionally after N, even when the phonological nasalization is blocked.
But can you have voice consonant that is closing followed by a nasal vowel, like bang, for example?
Well, there's no voiced obstruents. It's a voiceless plus voiceless aspirated.
Okay.
But yes, you can have b followed by a nasalized vowel. I don't use any items like that in the study because I don't know any specific examples with b followed by nasalized vowel, but it is theoretically possible. But just because of the historic sources of nasalization in Gaelic, there are some situations where it just never really seems to.
Yeah, I just have a short question about nasalization. In those cases where you have nasalization, right? Do you have any variation within speakers?
I don't think so within speakers, no.
Right.
I think it's fairly consistent. Yeah.
All the time.
Matin will always be of a nasalized vowel for within speaker. So moving on to the important bit, radical b and m in Gaelic both alternate with lenited v. Radical initial v doesn't occur in native lexical roots, but importantly is not a general phonotypic constraint. That'll become relevant in a wee while. So you do get non-alternating initial v in function words and so on. But in native lexical roots, you don't have radical initial v. But it's not phonotypics that do this. It's something else. When you lenite a form like matin, where the vowel is nasalized, the vowel remains nasalized. Matin. And some nasalization may actually also occur on the v itself. So the first part of matin is very distinct from the first part of vatan, where there's no nasalization at all, because vatan, the radical form is v, and there's no nasalization. So what we have here is an example of paradigm uniformity at the level of categorical phonology. If you follow my assumption that this nasalization is phonologically derived by default spreading. But when you lenite items like marak, no nasalization appears to remain on the vowel. So even though you have some gradient phonetic nasalization in the vowel of marak, you get no nasalization in the lenited form varak. So the first part of varak appears to be identical to the first part of vara, even though that's derived from b instead of m. Any detectable difference there between varak and vara would be incomplete neutralization. So I'm searching for incomplete neutralization in the lenition of these items. The scenario with no incomplete neutralization would mean that nasalization in the lenited form depends only on whether or not there is categorical phonological nasalization in radical form. So a form like vara will be the same as a form like varak. Whether the radical consonant is b or m is not a significant predictor. What's important is whether the following vowel is nasalized in the radical form. The incomplete neutralization scenario, nasalization in the lenited form may be additionally sensitive to whether or not there is gradient phonetic nasalization in the radical form. In other words, vara and varak will be subtly different, and the identity of the radical consonant, b or m, will be a significant predictor. So I'm going to be looking at the degree of nasalization in vowel, also in v itself, in case the v itself retains traces of its underlying nasality. And I'm also going to look at the duration of initial v, because a quick look at a different data set shows that initial b is considerably longer than initial m in Gaelic. So because things like final devoicing, the incomplete neutralization often manifests itself in durational effects, one good place to look for incomplete neutralization here would be whether initial v is any longer when it's derived from b than when it's derived from m. For male speakers, a subset of the speakers from the vowel study recorded wearing nasal airflow mask, 384 stimuli, So the stimuli were radical, target stimuli were radical forms in B and M and their corresponding lenited forms. Radical forms are produced in isolation, the lenited forms are a triggering particle in front of them. Extracted nasal airflow throughout each segment. So from radical forms, I extracted nasal airflow from the following vowel. I didn't extract nasal airflow from the B or M because A, it's hard to segment an initial consonant when there is nothing preceding it. And also, I'm not interested in comparing nasalization in B versus M because obviously they're going to be completely different. In the lenited forms, I looked at nasalization in both the initial V and the following vowel. And so, this is what the nasal airflow traces look like, average across all speakers for those items. You might not be able to see them very clearly. Red dotted line is a radical form. So the red dotted line only appears during the vowel. You can assume that during M, the red dotted line is off the chart, and during B, the red dotted line is approximately 0. So in all the B forms, the red dotted line is basically 0. In the forms which I said earlier have categorical phonological nasalization, categorical phonological nasalization, such as matin, mahith, miar, and mias. The nasal airflow, it decreases from the M, but it remains elevated throughout the duration of the vowel. So the red dotted line doesn't get any lower than this in matin, or mahith, or miar, or mias. Whereas in the forms with blocking, so marak, maraig, morogan, and murin, the red dotted line slopes down very rapidly, and it's down at 0 by the time you get to the end of the vowel. So even though things like differences in vowel quality will affect the exact level of nasalization, because you have the impedance effect, where higher tongue position means greater nasal airflow, I interpret matin, mahith, miar, and mias as having a plateau-like pattern of nasalization throughout the vowel, whereas marak, marag, marag, and murin, it's a gradient climb down to 0. So if we look at the degree of nasalization following on the vowel, following the initial V, and on initial V itself, on the left, in each case, we have the words with the radical B. So this is looking at the lenited forms. So in every case, these are forms beginning with V. If the V is derived from B, nasalization is basically 0 on both the consonant and the vowel. If it's a form derived from M, which has categorical phonological nasalization, you have elevated nasal airflow during the vowel and during the consonant to a lesser extent. And the forms derived from M, where there is no categorical nasalization, they look very much like the forms derived from B. So I fitted LME models for the degree of nasalization on the vowel following the initial V. Null model, the model with no incomplete neutralization, the fixed effects. The fixed effect is just whether or not there's categorical nasalization in the radical form. Random intercepts in speaker and stimulus. The alternative model, where there is incomplete neutralization, you have an additional fixed effect of the identity of the radical consonant. And I carried out a likelihood ratio test to see if this additional fixed effect had any significant improvement on the fit of the model. And there was no significant effect. So this was on the vowel following the initial V. Also check the initial V itself, because some nasalization can occur during the V. Again, no significant effect. Look at duration of the initial V, just in case duration is affected. It looks like there's very little difference at all across all conditions, and indeed no significant improvement. So what makes initial mutation different? Well,
Why is it different? Different because
different in the sense that there has been no reliable evidence for any kind of incomplete neutralization so far. whereas there's widespread evidence in things like final devoicing. So, if we compare mutational paradigms with paradigms involving straightforwardly concatenative morphology, one thing that can be suggested is that they are fundamentally differently structured in the mental lexicon. I thought I corrected that typo, maybe I saw it. Although they do have similar priming effects, so it's been found with Welsh initial mutations and Gaelic initial mutations, you have similar priming effects in mutational paradigms to what you have in straightforwardly concatenative morphology. There's also some studies looking at Arabic and Maltese, which, despite the non-concatenative morphology, you have similar priming effects. Could it be frequency? One reviewer for the paper based on this study suggested, could it be the case that radical forms are just less frequent than mutated forms, so cannot act as a derivational base? In Welsh, mutated forms only make up 13.8% of tokens in this corpus. In Gaelic, you can make a rough estimate from a corpus of Gaelic literature. Mutated forms are less than a third of tokens. So it's not the case that radical forms just aren't frequent enough to act as a base. Articulatory reason. Nasalization in lenited forms would be occurring on or adjacent to a fricative v, and we know that fricatives tend to be incompatible with nasalization because it's difficult to have sufficient oral airflow to produce a fricative while also letting air escape through the velum. But, I mean, we know that in Gaelic, nasalization can occur during v in forms like vatin. I sort of glossed over that bit quite quickly, but in some forms like vatin, you do very often get some nasal airflow during the v. So it's clearly not incompatible with nasalization in Gaelic. And the answer to that could be Warner et al. In a nasal airflow study of Gaelic fricatives find that when nasalization does occur on a fricative, it actually tends to coincide with a more approximate-like realization. So it could be that v is just not always a true fricative articulatorily. Orthography could potentially play a role. So most reported cases, as well known, concern contrasts that are faithfully represented in orthography, such as final devoicing in German, hat versus hat. And the presence or degree of incomplete neutralization depends on the salience of orthography during elicitation. But Karl Moff argues that orthography may play a role regardless of whether it is involved in the experimental setup, citing evidence that orthography actually forms part of the grammatical knowledge of literate speakers. So it could be that regardless of whether orthography exists in the experimental setup, speakers of Celtic languages like Scottish Gaelic, they're all minority languages. Speakers aren't exposed very much to orthography compared to major national languages like German, Dutch, Polish, Russian, where final devoicing is well known to occur. So it could just be that orthographic representations are weaker in the mental lexicons of those speakers. Nancy Hall raises a similar point with respect to a variety of Arabic, where she finds a lack of incomplete neutralization. But it's unlikely that this will fully explain the patterns. Seyfarth et al. Argue, based on the fact that they don't find incomplete neutralization in initial mutation in Javanese, that it's restricted to cases when word-specific morphological pressures come into conflict with language-wide phonotactic constraints. And it's when you have that conflict that you get an intermediate form. So in German, you have a morphological requirement that hat have a final D, because that is the form of the morpheme, but you have phonotactic ban on voiced final rosters. But with initial mutation, the neutralization is not driven by phonotactics, it's driven by the morphology itself. So there's no such conflict there. So the lack of incomplete neutralization in initial mutation is definitely consistent with Seyfarth et al.'s proposals. And finally, Hall relatedly says that incomplete neutralization is perhaps restricted to more highly transparent phonetically natural processes, based on two different processes that she looks at in a variety of Arabic. One which shows incomplete neutralization, one which doesn't. So final devoicing is highly transparent. and it is phonetically natural. It's driven by well-known phonetic constraints on final voiced obstruents, whereas initial mutation is deeply morphologized and it has no phonetic motivation at all, synchronically. So, sorry for taking up literally the entire 2 hours. We've looked at vowel orthography in Scottish Gaelic and found that it's phonetic in some speakers, phonological in others. So we have some variation there, so it's undergoing stabilization in the community. And we've looked at another study on nasalization, and we found that phonetic and phonological nasalization coexist together in Scottish Gaelic, but only phonological nasalization is sensitive to morphological condition. So, thank you for listening.
Okay. We'll take 5 minutes for questions. There's a question here. It's not directly about this topic.
So the question about studies on mutation and acquisition.
Yeah.
How do children learn the mutations? I'm not specifically aware of any studies on acquisition of initial mutations at all. I think I would probably know about it if there were, because I tracked down, I think, all of the literature, certainly on Celtic initial mutations. So I would probably know about it if there were studies on acquisition.
Okay. Other questions?
So you mentioned that why not nutrition? Are these speakers like very confident in their language? Would be like overcommenting a lot of philosophies like the language is loaded or something like this?
Yes, I suppose so. That's also a possibility. We could just be looking at the loss of a phonological rule, but its phonetic analog still is still there because we still very clearly see the significant difference between the two conditions. Yeah. Yeah, it could be. I hadn't really thought of it in terms of whether.
Could you group them into groups when you listen to them or not?
Not really, no. So yeah, I mean, sometimes it was the younger speakers who I found spoke Gaelic, which didn't seem to preserve as many of the contrasts that are found in older speakers. Yeah. Even some of the younger speakers, you have very clear phonological distinction in the vowels. So there doesn't seem to be a correlation there between whether they were younger speakers who had lost some of the other contrasts and so
on. I have a question about just the methodology of the first part. So did you give people the how did you test for their pronunciation? Just the first part. You don't have to go back there. But like there was a sentence. It is something that right, the script sentence, right? Did you show them like written?
Oh yeah, provide them with a word list.
Literate.
Yeah, they were all literate enough to carry the task. Yeah.
Okay, because it's a minority language, of the speakers are not literate.
I did have an English gloss next to each word, but yes, these speakers were all sufficiently literate to be able to carry the task. They may, and yeah, if they paused on a word, then the English gloss, they'd probably still be able to work out which word I was going for.
Okay, I think we can finish now, unless you want to ask, because we also have a meeting in like 30 minutes.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you. Katja.
La remarque. Et pour je me suis dit que vous pourriez peut-être venir au cours de phonologie de master si ça vous intéresse. Ce mercredi à 7 à 4 heures. Je ne sais pas si vous travaillez. C'est pas partie du stage.
stop this. So this thing, so this thing will be online